Слава.
Слава Україні.
Героям слава.
Yep. I think we can start right away. I'll probably ask Val to explain what this broadcast and what this show is all about. But the first thing I really want to check in because there's something that really bothers me today, and it's so bizarre. And I wanted to check in with both of you guys to kind of see if it's something that really bothers just me or it's really bonkers. Is that
Go ahead.
that story about a Russian woman making a tattoo from a picture that Ukrainian boy who was raped by Russian soldiers drew? And I feel like a lot of people have completely, gone mad about it, including me. And there are a lot of things that really bother me about it. But first, I wanted to just check in. Have you heard the story? And if you did, is it also feels completely crazy for you?
I honestly did not. Today I've been, as I told you, in a bit of a living my. It feels like I have two lives now. Like the life I had before that sometimes I live again, and the life that I have now. But I honestly haven't seen it. But the first thing, as we're just talking, I'm like straight to your Twitter to see. I'm sure you posted about it, but it sounds nuts.
Jane, have you heard about it?
I saw it float by my Twitter stream, but with the escalation at the Azov steel plant, that's where my attention's been this morning.
Yeah, and it's early. Also, you.
It's 11 a.m. here. Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you so much for joining. I'll just quote one of the threads quickly because, apart from bizarre story, there is an important message about colonial appropriation. And, some Ukrainians pointed out that no matter how bizarre the story is, it's a good illustration how Russian colonial appropriation really works. So I reposted this quick small thread by Alexandra Porovznik, and she wrote that, here's a quote. All right, so Russian woman got a tattoo of a drawing made by an 11-year-old boy who had been raped by Russian soldiers. Despite the fact that the woman in question claims to be anti-war, I still cannot believe we have to explain why this is heartbreakingly offensive. Here's the thing, which even anti-war, I'm honestly not sure how that works as long as they're still financing the war by paying taxes and justifying by spreading imperialist narratives. So anti-war Russians don't seem to get this is not your trauma. You do not get to turn the pain of a Ukrainian child raped by soldiers paid with your taxes into a badge of political dissent for your friends to fawn over on social media. You do not get to tell Ukrainians that they're too sensitive for being shocked or offended. And if you are, as you claim, an ally, then the first step you need to take is to shut up, listen to what Ukrainians, aka the actual victims of this war, are saying. You do not get to claim to be an ally while actually using people's pain for your own self-validation. And I think, this is amazing explanation, amazing illustration of a lot of things that we discuss here all the time. So please do check that thread. I think it's quite brilliant. Okay, so sorry for venting.
No.
Go ahead.
That's why we're here. And I was just going to say that, today I'm a little bit nervous about our session because it's a heavy topic that we're talking about. And I think I really hope I'm in good company, so it will be fine. But I think this is a space for us to do what you just said, which is vent and share how we feel. So I'm going to read what actually we in the very beginning put together as the main concept behind our show, which we read out every day, every time. So quickly to say why we're here for people who have never listened to us before and to remind those who have, is that Ukrainian Spaces was started because we see millions of Ukrainians with perfect English sharing their stories across all social media platforms, yet conversations about Ukraine are still dominated by Western, mostly white, and mostly male folks. Not only does this continuously rob us Ukrainians of agency, but it also perpetuates outdated, misleading, false narratives about Ukraine and Ukrainians, whether that is intentionally or not. So what we want to do here is we want to foster a relaxed, safe, and just chill space for Ukrainian voices to express themselves without the need of fitting Western boxes. The rest can use the space to educate themselves and decolonize their views of Ukrainians. So that's what we're today. I think each time we try to pick a topic to decolonize, but Maksym and I think Jane as well, felt that we needed the space to talk a little bit about grieving. And I'll pass back to Maksym.
Yeah, I just add very quickly that we also exist as podcasts. So all these sessions are then recorded and re-uploaded as podcasts on Spotify and Apple. And please subscribe. And also don't forget to rate them, because it's important for Ukrainian voices to trend on podcast platforms too. And also we launched Patreon quite recently to elevate our production, but also help us to carry on, because it's 100% volunteer effort that we do on top of everything else we are supposed to do to support ourselves and our families. And yeah, and the topic today, we discussed it a lot about the emotional state that a lot of Ukrainians are going through, those who are on the ground, those who are outside of Ukraine on various front lines. And there are a lot of conversations about how to, especially for allies or friends, how to be properly supportive of Ukrainians. And even there are discussions inside among Ukrainians. I remember one of our previous guests and our supporter, Tatiana Denford, she posted these slides on Instagram. It was called the Easy No-Cost Guide on How to Be an Ally to Ukrainians. And the first slide was like, asked us if we're okay and if our family is safe. And when she posted, there are other Ukrainians who came and say like, well, I disagree. I don't want to be asked if I'm okay at all, because it's very triggering, and it made me think a lot about what is appropriate, what is not, how's grieving is going, how's trauma is being processed, and maybe this is going to be a good session for everyone else to learn how to be a really supportive ally. Yeah, and as Jane always says, it helps to talk about it. It's a bit liberating and healing as well. So yeah, Jane, in our best traditions, I know that you don't need any introduction, but we allow Ukrainians to intro themselves absolutely the way they wanted to be introduced. So tell us who you are, what you're doing, where you come from, whatever you feel comfortable sharing.
Yeah, thank you. So my name is Jane, Zhenya, but Jane is the name I chose when I moved to Canada at age 11 from Kiev. And most of my life has been spent in Canada. And I say that to highlight that what we're talking about today, for me, will come from the perspective of the diaspora. Not somebody who has lived in Ukraine her whole life. I'm also a reporter and a researcher. For the past 6 years, I have focused on disinformation, a wonderfully light topic.
Absolutely.
And now I am doing my best to report on Ukraine as well. Really, when I first reached out to you, Maksym, in the DMs, I wanted to talk about vicarious trauma and the way that it can exacerbate grief and the way that it can impact our mental health. Maybe I'll leave it there, but that's how I wanted to frame the conversation. Somebody who doesn't know what it's like to have a bomb fly over her head. Somebody who's lived in the diaspora for a very long time, but also somebody who has a lot of experience looking at exceedingly horrible things on the internet.
Yeah, and this is, I think we also discussed it privately because especially during first weeks, as people who live, as Ukrainians who live abroad, you definitely develop this quickly guilt that you're not there and you're not the one who is on the ground, the one who's been bombed. Your families get to experience that. And you have this guilt, and in a way to compensate for this guilt, you kind of try to observe all the information possible. Well, because first of all, you don't want to miss anything, maybe something that happens to your loved ones, and you want to mitigate all the risks possible and have as much information as possible. But also, you kind of absorb every piece of footage and story of all these horrible things that happen in mass during genocide. And of course, it does horrible things to your psychological state, is it not? And I think it's very closely related to the work that you did even before that on disinformation and just being a journalist you know, when you pass through yourself so much information that is oftentimes disturbing and quite traumatic.
Yeah, and let me just take a step back here and talk through what vicarious trauma even is and
Hmm.
how it works. So, vicarious trauma is the term that originally applied to journalists who work in the field, who are absorbing not just journalists, but also aid workers, volunteers, and people who are exposed to a high volume of difficult and traumatic stories. And what the term implies is that you haven't necessarily gone through the situation that people around you have gone through, but by virtue of hearing about the situation or seeing a part of the situation, you are also in mental distress. And of course, this applies a lot to reporters, but I've been thinking a lot about how this applies to everyone watching the horrible things Russians do to Ukrainians online, particularly after Russians exit an area. We get a big flood of really difficult, really dark stories, images, and videos. And I think as Ukrainians, we have a certain responsibility not just to absorb all of those stories, but particularly as members of the diaspora to translate them into our own communities, into Western press, to amplify these stories as much as possible to try to get as much aid to Ukraine as possible. Um, but psychologically, vicarious trauma tends to be worse if you're somebody who is familiar with the situation, who's involved in the situation, or if you know somebody who is who may be part of the situation. And for Ukrainians, that means that the psychological toll of seeing all of these images is something that will, of course, be difficult for us, but is something that we need to be very acutely aware of. Because one of the really perverse things that vicarious trauma does is sometimes you begin to absorb all of these horrors just to absorb them as a sort of
Hmm.
reaction to them. And that's both unproductive and incredibly damaging. And I think it's something that we can all probably relate to as well.
Yeah, 70 days of that, definitely. I mean, well, first of all, I think I told you your voice is so soothing. This is the best uh, kind of, I don't know, this is the best voice to talk about this in general because I feel
I'm
so,
channeling
uh,
Aristovich, can you tell?
yeah, I instantly feel so safe and comforted, and I want to share as much as possible as well. And yeah, I mean, oh, I know Val has a question because she did a fantastic post on the same topic. But I just wanted to like share a quick experience because in the beginning, maybe several weeks after, my mom loves to have these walks in parks and in a forest not far. Well, it's not a forest, it's a steppe, but anyway, so um, and we had to talk about the mines and the remnants of rockets and how it's like dangerous and what they look like, and she should watch out her steps and constantly see it, look for it. And then I was taking a park walk in Prague, and I I was walking and I got scared of like some speed bumps or whatever because they looked like mines. So it was automatic reaction, not even like not even logical because there are no mines here, but because you're so into it and you know how they look and what they do, um, that was so bizarre for me to experience. And it's I still kind of watch where I step all the time automatically, which is again bizarre, but exactly what you're talking about, I think.
Yeah, yeah. And I don't know if you guys have seen, but on my Instagram, I did a video just randomly out of nowhere that just basically like shows a day in the life of someone who lives abroad but is Ukrainian, and like how our brain is responding right now. And it's basically like, we're trying to live life normally, but it's essentially like, I personally get this like every couple of, whenever I close my eyes, I'll get like images of things back at home, and that's what I tried to show in my video. But I would just wanted to say as well, Jane, thank you so much for bringing this topic to us and to this space, because I've spent the past 5 years working as the global social media manager for Amnesty International. And for those of you who don't know, it's a human rights organization. So basically, I've spent 5 years looking at people submitting human rights violations and videos and photos and stories and whatnot onto all of our social media platforms across the board. And I think social media has been such in terms of vicarious trauma, overlooked part of training. So as you said, it started with journalism. It started with, people who, for example, I don't know, at the BBC were editing videos in London. They were not necessarily in the hotspots, not seeing some of this violence, but they were still affected by it. And I think it's really important for us to even more so acknowledge the effects that social media has had on all of us in terms of vicarious trauma that I think have been overlooked for such a long time. And there's so many practical tips that one can do, which is what I wanted to ask Jane next. But just also to say the point that you said about how vicarious trauma is so much worse when you're familiar with the place, the faces, the stories, the people, the country, that I think that's something that I would probably ask for our audiences, and in general people who deal with us, to acknowledge that yes, it's terrible for everyone, but imagine looking at this when it's something you can recognize and something you can see. But Jane, I wanted to ask you about, basically, you can share your personal coping mechanisms or sort of advice and tips on vicarious trauma, or sort of the more uh, academic related stuff that a lot of journalists get trained on as well, because I'm sure we have different coping mechanisms, but it would be good to hear as well, and maybe some people will find it useful as well in their day-to-day lives.
Yeah, I can do both personal and academic, with the caveat that, of course, I'm not a trained psychiatrist. And so what I'm talking about is really what I've been trained on in my various newsrooms, information that I sought out myself and my personal experience. Not a doctor. But for me, one of the most important things is to recognize the symptoms early on. There are a lot of symptoms to vicarious trauma, and they will present themselves at different times and in different ways for different people. For me, I know that the vicarious trauma is extreme when I begin sort of disassociating and not really recognizing my surroundings as the surroundings that my brain is in. And what I mean by that is psychologically, what happens when you see either a high volume of distressing images or one particularly distressing image, is your brain goes on high alert. It begins to look for the threat that it perceives by seeing that image. And you begin going into this sort of fight or flight mechanism. And I don't know if this is an experience you guys have had, but you sort of look up from your phone and your computer and you wonder if you're in the same place, if you're in a place that is real. And Val, I think your video on Instagram actually illustrated this feeling quite well. And with a feeling like that, that's, it's a particularly extreme symptom, but it's also a symptom that means you need to go outside. You need to step away urgently. The reason for that is because, like all trauma, vicarious trauma lives in your body. And it has a way of piling up and presenting itself in very extreme ways later on. This can mean being antisocial. Something that I've struggled with is difficulty speaking with people who want to think about something else, not Ukraine, or who are maybe a little bit ignorant about what's going on in Ukraine. It can present itself in random aggression, and it can also present itself in increased substance use, which I think is really important to acknowledge as well. But acknowledging that those are the symptoms, the psychological symptoms that you may be going through, is an extremely important first step.
Absolutely. And I hope that, just your sort of outline of what vicarious trauma is and the symptoms, what you described right now, will help others hear and who will listen to us to identify that we're all going through something similar. But before I pass on to Maksym, I wanted to just read a quote that one of my colleagues shared with me early on, and when I was starting out in activism and social media and things like that. And it's by an American writer and civil rights activist, Audre Lorde. And I think it just is so important for us Ukrainians right now, which is that caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation. And that is an act of political warfare, because this is where the quote stops and I start. But essentially, Ukraine needs us right now more than ever. And the more we pay attention to how we feel and how we are, the longer we can go on helping our country.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, as Jane was like describing the symptoms, I was aware of vicarious trauma, in general, and partially because also a lot of journalists in recent years, including like Jane, were bringing that up more often. But then, yeah, I remember it was especially acute during first weeks when you had almost no time to um, do anything except something on your phone and constantly being watching the news, processing, working. And then you just go, even when you go outside, it was sometimes even painful experience to go outside because it wouldn't match whatever is happening inside your head and experience that you had through your screen. And people would like, you know, do go for coffee and have their lives, and you watch all of it and you feel this extreme alienation to the point that it's psychologically uncomfortable, and you want to just go back and to your safe space and keep like absorbing, watching, reading, being on the phone with your family, which back then I thought it's just a normal reaction, but then you naturally understand that no, you have to still take those breaks. Otherwise, you start exhibit those symptoms. And, in my case, it's aggressions, microaggressions in situations and towards people not warranted at all, in very bizarre situations, right? One thing in very practical way, because I know that a lot of journalists always listen to us and specifically to this show because they want to understand how to better cover the topic. But one of the questions is always there is how to better talk to Ukrainians at this point so you do not trigger them and you do not kind of make the situation worse, and what kind of questions or what kind of angles it's better to avoid altogether in the context of vicarious trauma, but also in general of taking care of emotional well-being of people you interview. So maybe you have any thoughts or any tips you would use yourself.
Yeah, there are some really important standards around trauma reporting that I actually think could be applied not just by journalists, but for people in their day-to-day lives. I don't want to give the cop-out answer of everybody's different and you should approach every person different, but that's true. Some of the things that you can do is, I don't think any Ukrainian right now knows how to answer the question, "How are you?"
Yeah.
Um,
It's and these days I don't even think I want to be asked about it. That's like so weird because it actually brings me more uncomfortable feelings because I have to stop and think and like
Yeah.
it's like
Or just
it's not
or just
usual.
reply, "I'm shit. Sorry guys, not great."
Yeah, I think it's also a bit like cultural divide because usually in the West, it's something that I learned. In the West, you're being asked all the time, casually, like, "How are you? How are you doing?" Right? And you must automatically reply, like, "I'm fine. How are you?" And this is not something in Ukraine. It's not like that. So if people ask you, "How are you?" it means that you need to stop and think and be kind of, honestly respond, "How are you?" Right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think the first distinction I would make is if you're asking how somebody else, be prepared to hear a very difficult answer. It's not something that Ukrainians can talk about flippantly in this moment, how we are, because even just from this conversation, obviously we're not okay. Um, the other thing that I would say is if you talk to anybody, for me, this is all I want to talk about. I can't talk about the Oscars or the Met or uh, like other news items. This is all I want to talk about. This is all I want to think about. But at the same time, it's difficult to play the role of educator. And so in these difficult conversations, it's important to pause and say, look, if you want to just tap out of this conversation, that's okay too. Um, that is an incredibly important tool that reporters use for speaking to people who have gone through something traumatic. Once in a while, check in and say, listen, are you okay right now? Do you want to keep going or do you want to stop? Um, but more than that, don't start a conversation without understanding what is going on in Ukraine. Um, it is very difficult to always play the role of educator, to be the only expert in the room, at least for me. and to keep answering the same, 5 questions about what's going on the ground. And so if um, you would like to engage in conversations with Ukrainians about Ukraine, take some time to learn about what's going on. Take some time to learn about how we're thinking about all of this. Take some time to be as empathetic as you possibly can.
Yeah, absolutely. And I always apologize in advance because I know that, sometimes my reactions to some of the questions could be really, on the verge of microaggressions just because they're triggering, not because the questions are dumb or insensitive, but just because not necessarily I can control my reaction to it or what it brings on the surface. And I really appreciate, friends and also some people and colleagues or random people that I have conversations, and they were extremely understanding about it. So unfortunately, 90% of the cases, especially people who do not know you well and they see this kind of a reaction, they take offense right away. But I would love for people to take that in mind, that for every Ukrainian you talk to these days, if there is a reaction that is a bit unpleasant, to never take it personally, unless you were super dumb and you asked some stupid, insensitive shit. Then just burn in shame forever. But otherwise, be really aware of this, that sometimes it's not about you. And in 99%, it's never about you. And people are going through some really traumatic shit.
Yeah, for sure. And I was just going to say, I'm extremely privileged that my job has given me a trauma therapist to work with me. But sort of, as you say, the main thing that she told me was that, you're not dealing with PTSD, something that you've experienced in the past and now you're trying to overcome. You're going through ongoing trauma. You're in it. You're like living it. You're gonna have to. It's good that we're dealing and talking about it now, but it's just so raw, and we're still trying to find the right words to describe how we're feeling, to respond to people, to explain our emotions, to explain our reactions. So I think what I ask from people around me, like my close ones, is just a bit of patience, as well, just a bit of patience in terms of my reactions and responses. But I wanted to quickly, there's an amazing, amazing resource that was done by, in Ukrainian actually, by Kyiv Dvorek, by a psychologist. Her name is Anna Panfilova, and it's about how to talk to Ukrainians. And I just wanted to quickly give the top highlights for what not to do when talking to a Ukrainian, which is one, I think first and foremost, do not ever say that you understand what a person has gone through, because all of our experiences are completely different. Not, everything, you can't say that you understand something because you just don't. We're all different. Don't ignore the topic, which is the second one. Don't pretend like nothing happened, which is what Jane was saying. The only thing we want to talk, many of us want to talk about, is the war. Others maybe don't, but just don't avoid the topic when talking to us. And yeah, just be aware that pretending like nothing happened may actually affect us even more. Then the third one is don't judge what a person has done or not done, and therefore don't tell them what to feel. And this relates particularly about questions like, why has your family decided not to leave Kiev, for example, or why have you decided to, I don't know, just things about people's choices. Just don't ask questions about them, because we can't control many of them and it affects us in a really negative way. And also don't generalize or compare people's situations. Don't try to shift focus to yourself or like a different situation or someone else you have heard about, or compare and say this situation was worse. At least you didn't, I don't know, lose your XY. And then finally, sympathize with the person, but don't victimize the person, because a lot of words can reinforce the position of a person as a victim, and a lot of people don't feel comfortable with that. So these are just some main tips to be aware of. But Jane, I wanted to ask you, I have seen, and I don't know if you feel the same way, but a lot of journalists, a lot of activists, a lot of people who have been working on topics related to war have been so desensitized in a way to suffering and seeing a lot of this stuff that I feel like, I don't know, I've seen some surprising reactions from those people towards Ukrainians and towards what we're going through. Do you think, is that something that has just been my experience, or do you think there's something around desensitization that we need to remind people to be wary of?
This is something that's an ongoing problem in the industry. And I was listening to a panel about freelance reporters in Ukraine maybe a week or two ago, who were Ukrainian reporters hired as producers, or I think we all hate the word fixers, but so-called fixers for Western outlets. And they described the callousness with which many Western reporters coming into Ukraine are treating the situation. You know, they described this horrible scene of Western reporters taking selfies in front of bombed out buildings, or not taking time to, even patiently speak to Ukrainians they are featuring in their reports, um, or not helping them if they need some just human help. And I think what they described is very widespread in the industry overall. There is sometimes desensitization. Let's pretend I can pronounce that word. To the point of inhumanity, and not just in covering Ukraine, but in covering many wars, many revolutions, many protests, and many civil rights issues. That's something that I think editors, reporters, and also regular people can try to push back on. But particularly if you find yourself desensitized to violence on the ground, that is an incredibly important sign that you need to step back and maybe take a break from your job, maybe focus on a different issue where you can adequately provide empathy to the people that you're talking about, or maybe have some conversations with your coworkers about what could be happening to you.
Yeah.
Because also, almost always, that desensitization is not something that will last. It's something that will catch up with you.
And I think it's a very important point and a bigger conversation. And we had this conversation with some of the journalists we also invite about the lack of empathy when it comes to reporting, especially Western reporting. And it's something that I think it's a completely different topic about the empathy. But I just remember when I was starting a journalist and I was introduced to these so-called Western standards of what journalism means and how you should be reporting on things, like this desanitized version of reporting where you're expected not to be empathetic and be completely divorced from the story you're trying to tell, is something that I always found extremely shocking, and I wouldn't kind of accept it because the stories that I would cover and the best stories that I would cover and the stories that I would feel the most accomplished about were always stories where I not only empathize, what had that empathy towards the story, but also cared and was honest about it. And this is the type of journalist I find the most um, not only satisfying to as a journalist, but also the most useful for a community or people you're trying to cover. Um, yeah, but maybe this is probably a bit different conversation from today. But I wanted, Jane, I wanted to ask you. I mean, I feel comfortable to share as much as you would like. But in the last 70 days of the genocide, personally, when you felt like, okay, this is something that is probably linked to vicarious trauma and I'm experiencing properly, have what kind of situations made you stop and think about it and acknowledge it? And how were you able to help yourself first and foremost as a journalist in these situations? Is it just being aware of it, or something else, or you sought maybe some support from friends or whatnot?
Yeah, I mean, I was about to call myself fortunate, but I don't know if that's really the word. But um, a benefit that I have is that through covering endless school shootings, attacks, environmental disasters, through the lens of disinformation, I am able to uh, understand the symptoms very quickly. But there was one video a few weeks ago after Russians sent in their propagandists into Mariupol that really shook me. And for 2 days, I felt like I was swimming in an aquarium. I didn't feel like I was mentally present. I won't describe the video, but it's quite graphic. And uh, the the thing that helps consistently, and the thing that I would love for our audience to take away is going to protests and packing boxes of humanitarian aid and doing something in the physical world that I know is contributing in some small way to sending aid to Ukraine, whether that's by increasing political will of local politicians through protests, or trying to, pack boxes and suitcases of um, tactical first aid kits that are going to go to Teroborona. Very proud to know how to pack a tactical first aid kit now. Um,
Hey.
and it's also when I've experienced both the most relief from vicarious trauma, and the most love and solidarity with people who are not Ukrainian, who come with me and show up anyway. Because these conversations among us Ukrainians are particularly healing. And of course, it's really difficult for non-Ukrainians to try to figure out how to approach us in the right way. But from my perspective, the way to approach us in the right way is to help. It's not just asking if we're okay. It's coming to the protests, it's coming to the church basements, it's soliciting donations. That, for me, is what provides any kind of relief. And has provided relief in the past. And it does the double duty of being incredibly useful to the war effort and also peeling you away from your screen.
Yes, and I we tell it, all the time during these broadcasts that basically we started it out of the same reason. Of course, we do a shitload of other volunteering elsewhere in many ways, and I'm personally privileged that I can do my work that is directly related to helping Ukraine. So it's not something you have to do, and it has no link to what is happening. But I know that unfortunately for many people that's not the case, and they have to show up to work, to their work that has nothing to do with what is happening with their home country. But on the most darkest days, literally, when you feel like you cannot do anything, you cannot form a thought, and you cannot concentrate. And we still decided to go for a broadcast with Valeria. And afterwards, you feel a tiny bit better, not only because it kind of serves as a therapy session um, among Ukrainians, but also because this is useful. And then people say it's useful for them, both to make them feel emotionally a bit better if they're Ukrainians, but also for allies to learn to be more effective at being a Ukrainian ally, for a journalist to cover stuff better. And yeah, you feel that you've done your part, and this is important. I think many
Yeah.
people do not understand that when I say, or when we say that we drown ourselves in volunteering and work for Ukraine, it's not to deny our feelings or not to bury them, but it actually helps. This is a different kind of things you center yourself.
100%. And I think, like, sometimes I was just going to say on Jane's point about helping. Um, I don't know if this is controversial to say, but I actually find it sometimes, just because of the sheer amount, the questions about, like, how are you? How can I help? What can I do? Who can I donate to? I find them overwhelming personally. So, like, for me, I guess my, like, message to people would be, like, just do what you can without asking us what it is you need to do, because anything will help, basically. Like, anything you can find, anything you can find proactively on our accounts, outside of our accounts, it doesn't matter what it is. Just do whatever you can, basically, because it's sometimes really overwhelming for us to respond all the time about, like, sources, donations, ways. And the other thing I was going to say, I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with being loud about how you're helping and who you're helping and what you're doing, because I think some people may feel a little bit like, oh, maybe, like, I don't want to jump on the bandwagon, blah, blah, blah. Don't think that. Just do it. I think it's so important for us. We've seen it have such a massive impact on our mental health, on the mental health of so many Ukrainians, and just be, what is the word? Don't say sorry for it. Just be super loud about the help that you're doing. But I also wanted to quickly give some practical steps to people about, from the social media perspective, about what we can all do in terms of vicarious trauma, and ways to sort of limit it. And this is particularly important for people who, I guess, it's their jobs to look at some of this footage and some of these posts and some of these videos. And so I guess the first super important step is to turn off autoplay on your videos on all platforms on your phone. You can just Google how to do that, but it just, it ensures that you proactively sit down and choose to start a video, as opposed to a video with something super graphic just pops into your feed and you are forced to look at it. That's just, I've done it, and it's really, really helped me. The second one is, you can cover parts of a photo or a video, even like with a piece of paper or your hand or whatever it is. If there's something that's particularly graphic, that there is no reason for you to see it, then I would recommend doing that. The other third thing, which is so important and we forget to do all the time, and that's why I think TikTok triggers me the most, is muting audio actually can help. So if you put your volume down, essentially, like, completely muted, if the audio is, of course, not critical to understanding what is going on, then I would really recommend it, because I think we react to audio with video, with imagery, much more than we do to just those things separated. So just, like, yeah, I think that's, like, one of the best tips ever, to mute, because especially if, I'm not going to go into details about what it is, but you can heighten your distress via certain sounds. And then also the other thing, and this is a big tip for all Ukrainians, in terms of both Telegram and WhatsApp and Signal and whatever we're using, we just need to deactivate our auto download, because we don't want all that stuff to essentially just straight away pop up into your camera roll. And just, yeah, whenever you sit down, whenever you're going to be viewing content, for example, before you open your Twitter account, just be aware that there might be content that is triggering, that is sensitive, and just be mindful of that. But I think getting closer to our last question to Jane, I think our favorite question with Maksym to everyone who comes here, and we've asked you this, I believe, in one of our earlier episodes before, but our favorite question is, for a lot of us, sort of, being Ukrainian has meant a lot of different things throughout our lives and years of, doing what we do. But we just wanted to know, what does being Ukrainian mean to you, and has that changed at all since the beginning of the full-scale invasion?
Oh man, I wish you could see me nod along with all of your practical tips. That was all really great advice. Um, you know, it's difficult to answer the question what being Ukrainian means to me. Um, I think uh, I think it means different things at different times. Um, right now, it means doing everything I possibly can to help our people. But it also means this like beautiful culture, uh, fantastic writing, and this feeling of unprecedented international solidarity among diasporas on different continents coming together all for the same reason, which is to get our land back, to live in freedom, the freedom that Ukrainians have been choosing and fighting for a very long time. And that's why, we started this conversation with the question of how do you talk to Ukrainians? And to me, the best way to talk to Ukrainians is to send us a picture of your donation to the army or to the volunteer efforts. To send, a little panorama video of you at a protest, to tell me how you've volunteered. Because to me, right now, being Ukrainian means rallying everybody I know around the same cause. Later, being Ukrainian will mean rebuilding. It changes from day to day, but I think right now it just means fighting.
This is one of the best responses we've ever had. And also, yeah, thank you. I'm really like all teared up because it's also so true. So thank you so much. But also, I wanted to let you know that it was our secret attempt to record your voice for an hour, and then I can put it on a loop and listen and, comfort myself in center, because this is also one of the most centering, most calming voices ever. So thank you so much for that as well today. So I think we're wrapping up, and I wanted to thank Jane. Thank you so much for coming and sharing both your experiences and both very extremely helpful stuff, and about how to deal with trauma for fellow Ukrainians, but also for our allies and other journalists to make of themselves better allies and just make their job doing their job better when it comes to covering Ukraine and talking to Ukrainians. And also to Valeria as well. Thank you so much, because your work in this has been amazing. But it also, for example, for me personally, it's been extremely helpful to learn a lot of stuff how I can deal with this situation as well. So thank you guys.
Thank you. Thanks,
It's
Maksym.
been amazing hour.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much, Jane and Maksym, and it was super great to talk with both of you today.
Thank you for having me. And if there's one last note that if I may leave our listeners with, Every volunteer effort, every dollar really, really helps. As we talk right now, the last holdouts in the Azov steel plant are being stormed. Putin's planning a May Day victory parade, and Ukrainian refugees and internally displaced peoples continue to need help. If you are somebody who can kick even $5 toward those help efforts, please do. We're in a place where the initial shock and flood of donations is dwindling, but the need is not. And so, if you're able to help, please give your time, your money, whatever you have.
But this is an extremely important message. We always emphasize it every time, that the amount of aid and help needed is staggering. This is a massive country. Tens of millions of people are affected. So please, even indeed 5 or 10 or $20, euros or whatnot, will make a difference every time. So, please do keep doing that. And yeah, that's it. I love you guys. Thank you so much for sharing this hour with me. Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава!
Slava.
Okay, bye-bye.